I think what is important in order to have the system work is people have to speak their views. So you go in there, and it begins with the National Security Advisor basically laying out the agenda and saying what does, and you begin with the Secretary of State, who is the senior member of the cabinet, who is supposed to represent what the diplomatic situation is. Then you turn to the Secretary of Defense, who then turns to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Sometimes you've already had the Director of the Intelligence present the intelligence picture. And these meetings do not work well if there is not really an argument. That is part of it. And the way I've described it is that a really good national security advisor has to break the eggs. You have to get people to state their views very clearly, or it does not work. And then the national security advisor tries to make an omelet. And if he or she can't make the omelet, the eggs are turned over to the president, who is going to try to get consensus. But you do argue. And if you don't argue, then the meetings aren't worth it. And so I think it's very important to have those arguments and have the different views stated. And it is the job of the Secretary of State to explain the diplomatic situation, and the job of the Secretary of Defense to really say what the force structure is, what's available. And they're great meetings, or at least the ones I was in, and I found them very useful. And what is interesting is you argue with your friends all the time, but because you see each other on a whole host of issues, you might take different positions on different meetings. And so it's very intimate and very direct. Sometimes you also, and we talked about, this is in the papers, you have a video screen. So when I was ambassador to the United Nations, I had to be in New York, and so I'd appear on the video screen. And in some ways it's harder and some ways easier because you're big there, sitting there on TV, and you can always say, well, I wasn't quite sure who was speaking, and so you can interrupt. So sometimes it's an advantage to be on the TV screen.
Well, there certainly is a division among President Obama's advisors in cabinet right now. Have you come down at all on whether or not he should follow the advice of his generals and increase troops up to the level of 40,000 in Afghanistan? Or do you go more along with people who are saying, mostly Democrats in Congress, we need to get out now. We are in an unwinnable war. If you increase the troops, it will look more like an occupying force, and we'll be right back into, the Vietnam quagmire.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand the background of all of this, and I won't go back through the whole history. But Afghanistan has been an area of dispute among various empires and also was a problem. I was in the Carter administration, and I was there when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And that was a huge step in the Cold War. And what happened was that the United States got very involved backing the Mujahideen, who pushed out the Soviets. So we have been in there a long time. I think that we didn't pay any attention to it after 1989 when the Soviets were pushed out, and the Taliban were able to get in there because there was chaos. I think it is important for people as they look at this to understand the history of what is a very difficult and chaotic place. I think that one of the major errors that was made, the people who hit us on 9/11 came from Afghanistan. And President Bush, I think, reacted immediately very, very well, and then turned our attention to Iraq, and Afghanistan got again into a very chaotic situation. So where I've been trying to analyze this, and I don't think that it's just a black and white answer. I believe that the people of Afghanistan can't begin to live a normal life or to give enough attention to training the military and the police if there isn't some security. So our forces that are part of NATO forces, I believe, are fulfilling a very important job. One of the problems with just having, quote, a counterterrorism, which means using predators to just kill based on information, we've killed some civilians along with that. That creates animosity. So my sense is we do not want to occupy Afghanistan. We can't be there forever. I think that the troops are necessary in order to train their troops. And so, to me, it's not a black and white answer, pull out or stay. I think we have to be there with a certain number of troops for a period of time until there is some sense of security. I also think that what is harder to analyze is the relationship between al-Qaeda and Taliban. The Taliban did provide safe haven to Osama bin Laden, and they do to some al-Qaeda. We have already destroyed some of al-Qaeda, but as President Obama said, we need to destroy and dismantle al-Qaeda. And then there are these discussions about good Taliban versus bad Taliban, and so it's not as clear as just saying we have to pull out. I do think what is important is the American people are owed a discussion when we are sending our military into harm's way. And so the questioning that's going on, I think, is useful, and it isn't just Democrat, Republican, it is basically a discussion about how long we will be there, and I think the American people are entitled to have answers to those questions.
All right. You know, let's move to Iraq for just a minute. In your book, Memo to the President, which is what you wrote before you knew who the president was in this last election, in talking about Iraq, you say in your memo, your predecessor, George Bush, felt anguish and prayed with loved ones, but was constrained by his own false logic from describing the invasion and what it turned out to be. And when you say what it turned out to be was an assault against terror that strengthened terror, a demonstration of American power that exposed the limits of that power, a campaign conducted on the nature of democracy that undercut democracy's good name, a blow against extremism that served the agenda of radicals in Iran and other places, and above all, a grisly human tragedy. That was your analysis then. Is it the same now? And the other thing you also said was that the challenge for President Obama would not be to re-argue why we got in, but how to get out.
Right. First of all, let me say I did give the book ultimately to President-elect Obama, and I wrote in it with the audacity to hope that this book will be useful. I think that the war in Iraq generally might go down in history of the U.S. as the greatest disaster in American foreign policy, for the number of reasons that I state and I stand by, which is that, in fact, Iran has gained greater power as a result of the war in Iraq. It is, in many ways, a regional hegemon as a result of it. It has undermined the good name of the United States, whether it is Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib. It hurt democracy because you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. I am chairman of the board, as was mentioned, of the National Democratic Institute, which supports democracy, which is a different issue. I'm very glad that Saddam Hussein is gone, but I believed that we had him in a box through the sanctions resolutions, and that in many ways the war in Iraq really has harmed us. I do think that President Obama is following through on what he said, which was how to get out of Iraq. There are going to be elections again in Iraq. There will be some attempt to keep a coalition government there, and there is a lot of work that still has to be done to rebuild Iraq. But what it has done to America's reputation is very damaging, and that is part of what President Obama is trying to restore by looking at what the rule of law should be, how to, and it affects, I think, obviously some of the decisions that you asked about and I explained on Afghanistan. So I stand by that.